We finished the entire Old Testament last week. Starting in January 2022, we finished all 39 books of the Old Testament through 129 sermons. Now, we will move on to the history of the New Testament, and we'll examine the New Testament from the introduction to the end of the book of Revelation in about 60 parts. Last week, we completed our study of entire Old Testament since January. Just as we've explored the 3,600 years of Old Testament history, let's take a calm look at the last 400 years of the history, the New Testament. On the other hand, it's only about 100 years old, and we'll cover that soon. There was a silence of about 400 years between the Old and New Testament before we dive into the New Testament. It's important to look at the history during this period, when there were no prophets or message from God. Understanding this gap will help us better grasp the connection between Old and New Testament. Today, we'll cover the history between these two testaments in one go, so please listen carefully. If you have questions, feel free to refer to the PowerPoint materials and explore various historical records to help you understand the New Testament more clearly. So before we look at the history between Old and New Testament, let's first organize and share the overall history of the Old Testament that we've examined so far. To understand the Old Testament, it is important to remember where its stories took place. The world of the Old Testament covers the Middle East today, centered on Israel, and includes neighboring countries like Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. To the south, we have Egypt, and to the east, there are Iraq and Iran, among others. The first story in the Bible is about creation, which is said to have happened around 6,000 years ago. Around 4000 BC, unlike what science teaches, the Bible suggests that history of the earth is only about 6,000 to 7,000 years. The Bible tells us that God created the world and people, and He was very happy. However, people who were meant to receive God's love ignored it and did what they wanted. Because of this, they were driven out of Garden of Eden. As humanity began to grow and prosper, they forgot about their Creator and lived according to their own desires, becoming corrupt. Eventually, they were judged by a flood, except for Noah and his family of 8. This flood occurred about 1,655 years after creation, around 2,350 BC. After the flood, humanity began to prosper again with Noah and his son, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Even though the world was destroyed by water, Noah and his children were not primitive. They were the ancestor of new humanity that had the knowledge and skills of the first humans, who lived about 1,700 years earlier. This was not just a simple society as some might think. For example, since Noah drank alcohol and acted shamefully, we can infer that they had advanced technology. They practiced farming, grew grapes, made wine, and raised animals for food. Even though the population was small, it likely developed quickly, just 100 to 300 years after the flood. Despite the previous judgment, humanity rebelled against God again by building the Tower of Babel, trying to make themselves like God. Instead of judging them again, God confused their languages, making it difficult for them to understand each other. As a result, humanity scattered and prospered across the world, each group speaking its own language. The Tower of Babel incident is thought to be closely connected to Mesopotamian civilization, located in the region of Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which is considered the first civilization of humanity. You may have learned that the Mesopotamian civilization developed about 1,000 years before the Nile River civilization in Egypt, the Indus River civilization in India, and the Yellow River civilization in China. The events of creation, the flood, and the separation of languages at the Tower of Babel happened just 100 to 150 years later. If you refer to the previous sermon, you can understand these events from both a common sense and scientific perspective. After the flood, the Tower of Babel incident led to the division of nations. Following that, God called a man named Abraham according to the Bible. Abraham was likely the first person to respond personally to God's call after the flood. He came from the Mesopotamian civilization and received God's call in a place called Ur, near the Persian Gulf. He responded with faith and followed God's guidance. Abraham moved to Haran in the north, near the Tigris and Euphrates River, where his father Terah died. After that, he left to go to the land that God wanted him to go find. This land was called Canaan. If you look at the map, you will see that Mediterranean Sea is on the left and the Jordan River, which connects the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea, is on the right. Abraham settled in this area, and later his descendants formed the nation called Israel and settled there. Today, the basis for Israel's claim to this land is Palestine comes from the Bible. Abraham's descendants were born in the land. He had a son named Isaac, who then had twins, Jacob and Esau. Esau, the older son, lost his birthright to Jacob. To escape his brother's anger, Jacob fled to Haran, where he took 4 wives and had 12 sons. Jacob favored Joseph, the son of Rachel, whom he loved, which caused jealousy among his other sons. Eventually, Joseph's brother sold him to Egyptian slave traders, and he was taken down to Egypt. In Egypt, after many challenges, Joseph became the prime minister. He eventually brought all 70 family members who were suffering from famine to Egypt around 1876 BC. They lived there peacefully until Joseph died. Over about 400 years, Jacob's descendants grew from 70 to about 2 million. As the number of Israelites increased, Egypt felt threatened and enslaved them, forcing them to build difficult structures and persecuting them. It became so severe that they even threw all the male children born into the Nile River and killed them. At the time, God remembered Israel, sent Moses to rescue them around 1446 BC. Based on his promise to Abraham, they were meant to go to the land of Canaan. However, instead of sending them there immediately after their rescue from Egypt, God took them to Mountain Sinai, where he established a very important covenant with them. Starting with the Ten Commandments, God gave Israel laws, regulations, and promises to help them live as his people. This is important because Israel's history depends on whether they followed this promise. God urged them to remember and keep this promise through the last prophet Malachi in the Old Testament, which then concluded. Therefore, the promise in Leviticus is crucial for understanding the history of the Bible. It serves as the center and core of the Bible, helping us determine if we, as a believer today, are following the right path of the faith. At Mountain Sinai, after giving these important promises, God finally sent the Israelites to the land of Canaan about a year later. However, at the Kadesh Barnea, the entrance to the Canaan, he first sent 12 spies. Because the spies were afraid of the inhabitants, the Israelites ended up spending another 40 years in the wilderness. And all of the first generation from the Exodus died. 40 years later, the second generation of Exodus approached Canaan again. This time from the plain of Moab, east of the Jordan River and above the Dead Sea. There Moses reminded them of the promises made at Mountain Sinai and made a new covenant with God. He urged them to live according to God's commands, ordinaries, and promises. This is what the book of Deuteronomy is about. Moses gave the command to lead the Israelites into Canaan to Joshua, and then he died. Around the 1406 BC, Joshua, who had already taken control of western region of Jordan River, divided the land among the half-tribe of Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben. He then led all the tribes across the Jordan River into Canaan, where a war broke out. First, he conquered the central region of Canaan, then the southern part, followed by the northern part. Eventually, he divided the land among the 12 tribes. Joshua died around 1390 BC. Now that Israel had taken possession of the land of Canaan, they lived there. However, the people did not follow the rules, commands, and the words that God had given at Mountain Sinai. Instead, they lived according to their own ideas. Because the people did not know the word God gave at Mountain Sinai, they ended up doing things he had forbidden and committing sins. As promised in Deuteronomy, neighboring countries grew strong and began to harass and persecute Israel. When the Israelites cried out to God and repented, he sent judges to save them. However, once the country became stable, the people neglected God's word again and continued to live in sin for about 350 years, starting around 1375 BC. This is what is described in the book of Judges. Through this cycle, the Israelites did not realize that only God is the true King and Savior. Instead, they turned away from God and asked for a human king like other nations. The first king they chose was a man named Saul. around 1050 BC. He started well, but ultimately became indifferent to God's desires. His end came when he went to war with the Philistines and died miserably along with his son. After Saul, David became king around 1010 BC. He was truly a man after God's heart. Although he made a serious mistake, he always turned to God, and as a result, God made great promises through David. Following those made to Abraham, God promised that Christ Jesus, who would save all mankind, would come through David's line. During David's reign, Israel reached its largest territory in history. After David, his son Solomon became king around 971 BC. He oversaw the first large-scale construction of the temple in Jerusalem. Following his father, Israel became even more prosperous. However, as the country thrived, the people suffered from the excessive construction activities. Additionally, Solomon married many foreign princesses, which led to Jerusalem becoming a place where idols from various countries were worshipped. After Solomon, the country eventually split in two in 931 BC. In the north, a man named Jeroboam from the tribe of Ephraim ruled over the 10 tribes, forming what is known as northern Israel, or sometimes Samaria or Ephraim. In the south, Solomon's son Rehoboam ruled over 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, which became known as southern Judah. In total, 20 kings ruled in the south and 19 kings in the north. The kings of northern Israel worshipped idols from the very beginning and fell into corruption. They made a golden calf their god. While they might not have completely rejected a traditional Mosaic law, they distorted its interpretation to create an image of God that suited their desires, turning the golden calf into a visible god. Among the kings of southern Judah, only about 8 lived somewhat good lives, while the rest were corrupt. Despite this, they maintained a sense of legitimacy centered around the temple in Jerusalem. However, southern Judah still had a distorted understanding of God and showed indifference and ignorance toward His word. God sent many prophets to urge the kings and people to return to the promises of Mount Sinai, calling them to repent. However, they refused to change their ways and even killed the prophets. In the end, northern Israel was destroyed by Assyria, the ruler of Mesopotamia at the time, in 722 BC, and its people were scattered to various nations. Southern Judah was invaded several times by Babylon, the next ruler of Mesopotamia, and was completely destroyed in 586 BC, with the remaining people taken captive to Babylon. After 70 years of captivity, when the Mesopotamian region changed from Babylon to Persia, the people returned to Jerusalem under the leader of the Persian king Cyrus. In 538 BC, about 50,000 people returned for the first time, led by Zerubbabel, and they rebuilt the Temple of Jerusalem. About 70 to 80 years later, during the reign of King Artaxerxes around 457 BC, the people returned for the second time under Ezra leadership and began a spiritual reform. However, they faced the challenges from neighboring countries and dissatisfaction among the priests and people. Then about 10 years later, around 445 BC, they returned for the third time under Nehemiah's leadership. Nehemiah rebuilt the wall of Jerusalem, and together with Ezra, they taught the people the statutes and ordinances from Mount Sinai and initiated another spiritual reform. However, despite their effort, the record written by Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament, shows that the people turned away from God's love, mocked it instead. As a result, God said he would send Elijah later, then remained silent. This is the story of the Old Testament. We have explored the entire history of the Old Testament, from creation to 400 BC, over the past 2 years. Now let's examine how history unfolded after Prophet Malachi from around 400 BC until the coming of Elijah and John the Baptist, as prophesied by Malachi. The timeline after Malachi shown on the screen is based on actual history. This aligns with the prophecy in Daniel chapter 2, made about 200 years earlier during the second year of Nebuchadnezzar in 604 BC, related to the events around 400 BC. The Jewish people living in and around Jerusalem continued to be ruled by a powerful nation after the Babylonian captivity. After Babylon came Persia, and after Persia, Greece. Following the death of Alexander the Great, the region was alternately ruled by the Ptolemaic Egyptian dynasty and the Seleucid dynasty known as Hellenistic Empire. After a period of independence, the area was eventually occupied by Rome, which ruled the Judean region through a man named Herod. During these 400 years of silence, this is how history unfolded around Israel. Let's take a closer look at each part. First, let's look at the big picture of how Alexander the Great emerged from the Greek Empire and Macedonia in North Greece to defeat Persia. As we know, the Persian Empire fought 2 wars with Greece under Darius I and Xerxes. But Persia lost repeatedly, ultimately leading to a Greek victory. The Greek city-states that fought Persia formed the Delian League, centered around Athens, to prepare for another invasion and raise the funds together for war. However, Athens used its military superiority to act dictatorially among the city-states. In response, the Peloponnesian League was formed, led by Sparta in southern Greece, and war broke out around 431 BC. During this time, a plague spread in Athens, killing about a third of the population, and the city eventually surrendered in 404 BC. As a result of a division among the Hellenic city-states, they became embroiled in internal conflict and entered a period of decline. During this time, Philip II of Macedonia from northern Greece defeated the allied forces of Athens and Thebes in the Battle of Chaeronea. In 338 BC, he unified Greece and emerged as the leader of the Greek war. However, after Philip II, who unified Greece, was assassinated in 336 BC, his son Alexander III, which is Alexander the Great, became king at the young age of 20. He quickly suppressed the rebellions in the Greek region, bringing stability. Though these rebellions were in a Greek city-states, Alexander viewed them as allies rather than enemies. To conquer Persia, he led an allied Greek force of 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry in 334 BC and began his expedition. At the time, Persia was still a great empire, despite internal strife and division after Artaxerxes. When Alexander won his first battle against Persia in 334 BC at the Battle of the Glenicus River in Lydia, he took control of a city in what is now Turkey, Asia Minor, and the Mediterranean coast. Then, in 333 BC, he defeated Darius III's army at the Battle of Issus and moved south to occupy Tyre, Syria, Palestine, and even Egypt. Afterward, he returned to the Persian mainland and fought the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, leading to Persia's complete collapse, unable to recover. In fact, it can't be said that Alexander fought many wars. The countries that had suffered under the Persian rule often viewed Alexander's army as a liberating force. Because of this, he was able to easily occupy cities and land, with only a few exceptions. In 331 BC, he decisively defeated Persia at the Battle of Gaugamela and then continued his campaign into India through present-day Iran and Afghanistan. However, due to fierce resistance from the Indians, the intense heat, and his soldiers' desire to return home, he eventually abandoned the expedition and returned to Babylon. There, he suddenly died of a fever at the young age of 33 in 323 BC. The achievement Alexander made in just 10 years were remarkable. His ambition was not just to conquer and rule the Eastern world through force or territory. His ultimate dream was to integrate the Greek and Oriental world both racially and culturally. To achieve this, Alexander took about 200 scholars and artists with him on his conquest. He established a city called Alexandria wherever he went, aiming to fuse Eastern and Western culture. He also rejected the narrow-minded Hellenistic view of past and promoted cosmopolitanism. He treated Macedonian and Asian soldiers equally, and he married a Persian woman himself as his queen, encouraging his followers to do the same. As a result, many countries around the Mediterranean were unified under Greek culture. One of the most significant aspects of this was the unification of language. While it wasn't complete, anyone who spoke Greek could not communicate. Egypt became a key center for Hellenistic fusion culture. Under the leadership of Ptolemy, one of the Alexander's subordinates, A massive museum and a grand library were built in Alexandria. From a Christian perspective, the most notable achievement was the translation of Torah into Greek. This Greek version of the Bible was that Paul used to preach during the New Testament era. Since the New Testament was mostly written in Greek, it allowed anyone in the Hellenistic cultural sphere to read it. The Bible that was not embraced by the chosen people who were given a mission. The Bible that was ignored by those who remember God's sincerity and sought to live according to His will. The Bible that the Hebrew people turned into a personal possession, bearing God's heart within it. The 400 years of silence were not just a time of disobedience, they were marked by a lack of recognition of God's presence by Ptolemy and Hellenistic kingdom. During this time, God was opening His heart to the entire world through outsiders. These 400 years were not a sign of God's indifference. Rather, it was a time when God prepared to come to earth and ultimately sacrifice Himself for those who betrayed and insulted them. Another important aspect, so these 400 years were not a sign of God's indifference. Rather, it was a time when God prepared to come to earth and ultimately sacrifice Himself for those who betrayed and insulted Him. Another important aspect is the Hellenistic culture, which promoted global unity, broke down barriers of regionalism and extreme nationalism in various countries. This was crucial because it created an environment where the gospel could be accepted without facing rejection from extreme nationalistic sentiments. When Paul preached the gospel, he faced more persecution and opposition from the Jews of Hebraism than from others. The brief 10-year achievement of Alexander the Great can be seen as paving a vital path for the spread of the gospel. Alexander the Great's brief 10 years reign was remarkable, but he died suddenly without a clear successor. This led to chaos in the Hellenic Empire, resulting in Diadochi war among his generals, who fought over his position. This territorial struggle lasted nearly 50 years, as outlined in Daniel chapter 11 and 12. The war was complex, with the successors shifting alliances based on their interest. After Alexander the Great, in the early Hellenic Empire was divided among 4 generals. Cassander ruled Macedonia. Lysimachus controlled Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, and Syria. Antigonus took Persia, including Babylon, and Ptolemy governed Egypt. These leaders claimed to be Alexander's legitimate heirs and fought over his legacy, often catering their dispute around Alexander's younger sons or relatives. Then in 301 BC, Antigonus and his allied forces fought at a place called Ipsos in Phrygia, where Antigonus was defeated and died. As conflict continued, the territory was eventually divided into 3 major regions, along with some smaller ones. Antigonus ruled the Greek mainland. Ptolemy continued to govern Egypt. Seleucus took control of the vast remaining land, Antigonus' connections to the Macedonian mainland arose because his son, who died in the Battle of Ipsos, became a leader in Greek region during the ongoing conflict. In the case of the Seleucid dynasty, Seleucus was originally the governor of the Babylonian region after Alexander's death. When Antigonus aimed to take control of all of Persia, Seleucus escaped to the Ptolemy in Egypt for protection. However, during the chaotic conflict, Seleucus managed to seize the vast Mesopotamian region for himself for nearly 150 years. The Ptolemaic Seleucid dynasty fought a prolonged war. The area between these two powers, so known as Syria-Palestine region, became a battleground. Israel, located in Palestine, suffered greatly as it was trampled by the both sides during their struggles. At first, Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt ruled the Palestine region, but around 198 BC, Antiochus III of the Seleucid dynasty won the war against Egypt and ruled the Palestine region. At the time, Antiochus III tried to win the heart of the Jew by rebuilding Jerusalem and exempting them from taxes. However, around 189 BC, this person was defeated by Rome, which was growing into a major power in the entire Mediterranean region at the time, and ended up having to pay heavy tribute to Rome. Let's take a quick look at Rome, which was rapidly rising in the western Mediterranean, just beyond Greece. From around 334 to 264 BC, Rome established in the Italian peninsula fought 3 wars with Carthage, a colony of Phoenicia from Tyre and Sidon. Over more than 50 years, known as the Punic Wars, these wars marked the turning point for Rome, allowing it to transform from a single city-state into a vast world empire that spanned the entire Mediterranean region. While Rome gradually gained strength in the western Mediterranean, both the Seleucid dynasty and the Ptolemaic dynasty were worn down from ongoing wars. Since around 300 BC, in 198 BC, Antiochus III of the Seleucid dynasty took control of Palestine from the Ptolemies. Initially, he aimed to win the favor of the Jewish people, but around 190 BC, he went to the war with Rome and suffered defeat. As a result, Antiochus III sent his second son, Antiochus IV, as a hostage to Rome and passed the throne to his eldest son. The eldest son, Seleucus IV, who became a king, faced the challenge of raising taxes from the ruled territories to pay the enormous war reparation his father owed to Rome. In his desperation, he even seized the treasures from the Temple of Jerusalem, which alienated the people and led to his eventual assassination in 175 BC. Following his death, Antiochus IV, who had been a hostage in Rome, succeeded his brother and ascended to the throne. Antiochus IV Epiphanes was the ruler who desecrated and trampled the temple, fulfilling the prophecy in Daniel chapter 8, verse 10 to 12. Deeply influenced by Greek culture during his time as a hostage in Rome. He aggressively promoted Hellenistic values. However, the Jewish people, rooted in their unique laws and traditions, largely rejected these foreign influences. While there are Hellenistic Jews, primarily among the religious elites like Sadducees, most of the population remained committed to their orthodox belief as Pharisees. Yet around 170 BC, significant tension arose that would change everything. Antiochus IV Epiphanes, frustrated by the burden left by his father Antiochus III and brother Seleucus IV, sought to regain wealth by attacking the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. Just as he was on the brink of victory, Rome intervened, forcing him to retreat empty-handed, a deeply humiliating defeat. In his anger, he turned against the Jewish people who resisted his effort to impose Hellenistic culture. September to eradicate Judaism. In his anger, he turned against the Jewish people who resisted his effort to impose a Hellenistic culture. Determined to eradicate Judaism, he unleashed a campaign of persecution against them, aiming to suppress their faith and traditions. Around 170 BC, as part of his Hellenization policy, he prohibited everything related to Jewish law. Antiochus IV Epiphanes, frustrated by the burden left by his father Antiochus III and brother Seleucus IV, sought to regain wealth by attacking the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. Just as he was on the brink of victory, Rome intervened, forcing him to retreat empty-handed, deeply humiliating defeat. In his anger, he turned against the Jewish people who resisted his effort to impose a Hellenistic culture, determined to eradicate Judaism. He unleashed a campaign of persecution against them, aiming to suppress their faith and tradition. The Jewish identity was deeply rooted in the faith of Torah. Antiochus IV Epiphanes prohibited all the practices related to the law, imposing several punishments for any violation. For instance, the traditional circumcision of baby on the 8th day was met with brutal consequences. If baby was circumcised, the mother faced execution and the lifeless infant would be hung around her neck. Moreover, entire household of those who performed the circumcision were also put to death. Antiochus IV Epiphanes abolished all temple worship and built an altar to Zeus in front of Jerusalem, desecrating it by sprinkling pig blood on the altar. He forced the Jewish people to perform pagan sacrifices and eat food forbidden by the law. As prophesied in Daniel 8 and 11, he destroyed the law. As prophesied in Daniel chapter 8 verse 11, he destroyed the law, prohibited the circumcision, and mandates the breaking of the Sabbath. He even sent enforcers to each village, compelling local leaders to worship idols and sacrifice pigs, and intensifying the oppression of the Jewish people. The people who rose up against Antiochus Antiochus IV were the Maccabean family. This uprising around 166 BC is known in world history as the Maccabean Rebellion. But from the Jewish perspective, it was an independent movement. As prophesied in the book of Daniel, the prohibition of temple sacrifice lasted about 1,290 days, or approximately 3.5 years. After this period, the temple was restored, and the altar that had been desecrated with pig blood was cleansed with water. This event occurred on December 25th in the Jewish calendar and is celebrated as Hanukkah, the holiday called the dedication. In the Gospel of John marks the day Judas Maccabeus drove out Antiochus Epiphanes and cleansed the temple in Jerusalem. The Maccabean revolt lasted about 6 years and 4 months, during which the Jewish people resisted Antiochus IV Epiphanes. During this time, the Seleucid dynasty faced the crisis from the rebellion in various region, which hindered their ability to respond effectively to the Jewish uprising. As a result, the Jews successfully broke away from the Seleucid rule and established their independence as a single nation. This marked a significant moment in Jewish history, allowing them to reclaim their religious practices and sovereignty. Judah Maccabee led a determined effort to reclaiming Jewish independence, rallying the Hasidim, those faithful to the Torah and their heritage, to his cause. Under his leadership, the Jewish forces achieved several significant victories against the Seleucid army. Ultimately reclaiming the Temple of Jerusalem, they purified the defiled temple and dedicated it to God, marking a pivotal moment in Jewish history. However, following the death of the Antiochus IV Epiphanes, during a conflict with the partitioned kingdom, the Seleucid dynasty regrouped. Despite their internal conflict, the Seleucid forces launched counteroffensive, leading to the tragic death of Judah's brothers Eleazar. This tumultuous period highlighted both the resilience of the Jewish people and the ongoing challenges they faced from external power. Demetrius, son of Seleucus IV, sought to stabilize the Seleucid kingdom by attempting to reconcile with the Jewish people after the tumultuous Maccabean revolt. However, his approach created a rift between the Maccabees and the Hasidim, the religious faction that had originally supported the Maccabean cause. This discord weakened the united front against the Seleucid influence and led to internal division within the Jewish community. As tension rose, the Maccabees, led by Judah and his brothers, faced the challenge of maintaining their hard-won independence while navigating the political intrigue of the Seleucid court. The delicate balance of power was crucial, as external threats loomed while internal strife threatened their newfound autonomy. This period marked a significant turning point in Jewish history, as the Maccabean leadership grappled with maintaining unity and defending their religious and cultural identity amidst changing alliances. Jonathan Maccabee took over leadership after the death of his brother Judas and the scattering of their forces. He proved to be a strategic leader, adept at navigating the complex political landscape of the time. Aligning with Rome, he sought to secure support against the Seleucid forces while also managing internal Jewish factions. Under Jonathan's leadership, the Maccabean forces gradually regained strength. In 152 BC, he successfully negotiated a truce with the Seleucid Empire, which recognized him as a high priest and governor of Judea, granting a level of autonomy. This marked a significant achievement as it solidified a Maccabean leadership and allowed them to focus on rebuilding and consolidating power. Jonathan's diplomacy and military prowess laid the foundation of the Maccabean dynasty, which continued to flourish until the rise of external threat and internal conflict would again challenge their authority. Simon Maccabee's leadership marked a pivotal moment for the Jewish nation. By uniting the Hellenic, Hasidic, and Maccabean faction, he not only consolidated power but also established a sense of national identity among the diverse group within Judea. His diplomatic skills and military strategy helped stabilize the region after a year of turmoil. In 142 BC, Simon declared the independence of Judea, a significant milestone celebrated by the Jewish people. He became both the high priest and a political leader, establishing the Hasmonean dynasty under his rule. The temple was restored and the Jewish people experienced a revival of religious and cultural practices. Simon's reign set the stage for further expansion and consolidation of Jewish autonomy, laying the groundwork for the eventual rise of the Hasmonean kingdom. However, his successes also planted the seed for future conflict, as internal division and external pressure would continue to challenge the stability of the newly independent states. Simon's reign indeed fostered a sense of the hope and renewal among the Jewish people. The independence they enjoyed for about 80 years became a time of cultural and religious revival, with the re-establishment of temple significance and the issuance of their own currency, symbolizing autonomy and national pride. During this period, many Jews believed that they were experiencing the fulfillment of messianic prophecies, anticipating a long-awaited deliverer. Hasmonean dynasty's effort to unify the nation, restore tradition practices, and expand their territory contribute to this sentiment. However, the underlying tensions, both internal faction and external threats, remained as the Hasmonean kings sought to consolidate power. The reality of governance, including conflict with neighboring regions and among different Jewish sects, would challenge the stability of this newly independent nation. This complex political landscape would set the stage for future upheavals and the eventual Roman intervention in Judea. John Hyrcanus faced significant challenges right from the start of his reign, especially with the Seleucid threat looming over Judea. To secure his position and prevent further invasions, he made strategic concessions, including the costly tribute to the Antiochus VII. This act demonstrated both the precariousness of his rule and the complex political dynamics of the time. Despite these difficulties, Hyrcanus worked to consolidate the Hasmonean power. He focused on expanding Judean territory, often engaging in military campaigns against the neighboring region, particularly the Edomite, whom he forcibly converted to Judaism. This expansion aimed to strengthen the kingdom and establish a more robust Jewish identity. Hyrcanus' reign also marked a significant religious development, as he sought to align political leadership with the priestly duties, reinforcing the Hasmonean dynasty claim to both political and religious authority. However, the internal division among different Jewish factions persisted, setting the stage for further conflict in the future. The Hasmonean dynasty faced challenges from the Seleucid dynasty, but after Antiochus VII died in a war with the Parthian kingdom in 129 BC, the Seleucid influence diminished significantly. This allowed John Hyrcanus to expand the Jewish nation, restoring to a level of power and territory comparable to the time of Solomon. Ironically, despite their fight against the Hellenic Empire for independence, the Hasmonean dynasty adopted the Hellenistic titles, reflecting the complexity of their situation. While they established political power as a result of a Maccabean revolt, their legitimacy was questioned since they descended from the priestly Levites rather than the royal line of David. The Pharisees, who joined the Maccabees in opposing Hellenization, became significant allies in this struggle. But the Hasmonean dual role as both king and priest created tension within the Jewish community regarding rightful leadership. To understand the origin of the Pharisees, we must look back to the Babylonian captivity during this time. The Israelites could no longer perform temple-centered ritual, making the role of priest and other law-related duties seem irrelevant. As they reflected on their situation, the importance of the law and the scripture became clear, leading to the emergence of groups focused on teaching and strictly observing the law, the precursor to the Pharisees. However, when the Israelites returned from captivity under Cyrus of Persia and began to rebuild their temple-centered life, the priestly class regained prominence, becoming seen as the ultimate authority on religious and legal matters. This shift created a tension between the Pharisees, who emphasized the personal adherence to the law, and the priests, who held the institutional power. In this historical context, a dual authority system emerged in Israelite society. Priestly aristocracy centered around the temple, and the scribe or the law scholars focused on the law. As this dual structure evolved, non-priest legal scholars began teaching and Pentateuch and its application to everyday life. This shift led to a growing distrust of the temple priest, especially as the Seleucid dynasty during the Hellenistic period accepted bribes and appointed individuals not of Aaronic lineage as priests. These appointed priests sought to maintain their power and privileges, forming the Sadducees who often aligned with the political elite, further complicating the religious landscape. To summarize, Israel's society was divided between the clergy class and their supporters, the Sadducees and the lay legal scholars and their followers, the Pharisees. This power struggle persisted during the Jesus' time and is crucial for understanding a new context. The primary venue for their debates and their conflict was the Sanhedrin, which means council in Hebrew, and Sanhedrin in Greek. This ruling body oversaw both religious and political life until the Jewish nation was destroyed by the Roman general Titus in AD 70. The origin of the Sanhedrin is uncertain. Some rabbis trace it back to the 70 elders who assisted Moses, but there is no evidence of a continuous organized council since that time. During the Persian Empire, elders are mentioned in the book of Ezra, indicating some form of governance. In the time of Nehemiah, leaders managed social affairs, suggesting a structured authority. The Sanhedrin is more clearly documented during the reign of Antiochus III of the Seleucid dynasty, as the ruling states needed an organized body to address and manage its demand. As Judea gained independence from the persecution of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Hasmonean dynasty appears to have introduced the Hellenistic governing structures, such as Sanhedrin. This move likely aimed to stabilize their rules, the Hasmonean being Levites who had become king. Filled this organization with the Sadducees, thereby aligning the ruling body with their own interest and consolidating their power over the Jewish population. This blend of priestly authority and political governance marked a significant development in the structure of Jewish leadership during the period. John Hyrcanus, the king of the Hasmonean dynasty, sought to strengthen Jewish society by conquering surrounding regions, notably the Edomite. He forcibly converted them to the Judaism through the circumcision, but not out of religious fervor, but to bolster the Jewish population and the power against the external threat. John Hyrcanus, the king of the Hasmonean dynasty, sought to strengthen Jewish society by conquering surrounding regions, notably the Edomite. He forcibly converted them to Judaism through circumcision, not out of religious fervor, but to bolster the Jewish population and the power against the external threat. This integration allowed skilled individuals from the Edomite territory to contribute to Jewish society. This historical context is significant as it later influenced the rise of the Herodian dynasty, with King Herod being of Edomite descent. Herod's rule over Judea reflects the complex dynamic of identity and power that emerged from these conquests. Judea gained independence through the Maccabees, who were of the Levitical tribes, but the Pharisees did not recognize their lineage as legitimate kings because they were not descendants of David from the tribe of Judah. This distinction created tension as the Pharisees viewed the Maccabean rules as primarily priestly rather than royal. John Hyrcanus, aligning with the Sadducees, deepened this divide, reinforcing the power dynamic between the Hasmonean dynasty and Pharisees. This conflict set the stage for ongoing struggles of authorities and interpretation of Jewish law in Judea. After John Hyrcanus, Aristobulus took the throne and continued his father's expansionist policies, compelling conquered people to adopt the Jewish law. However, his Hellenistic mindset further alienated him from the Pharisees, who resisted the influence of the Greek culture and maintained a strong commitment to traditional Jewish practices. This growing divide contributed to ongoing tensions between the ruling Hasmonean and the Pharisees, complicating the political and religious landscape of Judea. After Aristobulus, Alexander Janus came to power, openly persecuted the Pharisees, exacerbating tension. In desperation, the Pharisees sought military aid from the Seleucid dynasty in Syria, hoping to overthrow Janus. However, the Syrian forces, instead of targeting the king, wreaked havoc across Judea, committing atrocities and looting. Realizing their mistake, the Pharisees then allied with the Janus to expel the Syrian army, highlighting the complex and often volatile nature of the political alliances during this turbulent period. After Aristobulus, Alexander Janus came to power and openly persecuted the Pharisees, exacerbating tensions. In desperation, the Pharisees sought military aid from the Seleucid dynasty in Syria, hoping to overthrow Janus. However, the Syrian forces, instead of targeting the king, wreaked havoc across Judea, committing atrocities and looting. Realizing their mistake, and Pharisees then allied with the Janus to expel the Syrian army, highlighting the complex and often volatile nature of the political alliances during the turbulent period. Please refer the scripture. I will send the email.